Well, ladies and gentlemen present and those people joining us online, my name is Emeritus Professor David Brown and I'm Chair of the Lionel Murphy Endowment Committee, formerly the Lionel Murphy Foundation. And I'd like to open proceedings by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people present here today. I'd also like to acknowledge Cameron Murphy, MLC. Just a little bit of background. The Lionel Murphy Foundation was established after Lionel Murphy's untimely death in 1986 to honour his significant contribution to public life as a reforming Attorney General in the Whitlam government and as a Justice of the High Court of Australia. The legal reforms advanced in his period as Attorney General are too many to list. In retrospect, it was we can look back on a burst of progressive law reform which we've not seen the like nearly 50 years later. But they include the introduction of the Family Law Act and the establishment of the Family Court, legislation outlawing racial and other discrimination, and the abolition of the death penalty. And his incisive judgments on the High Court include his prescient evisceration of the conviction of Lindy Chamberlain and his evocation of Oscar Wilde in Neil Against the Queen, and the famous words, "Mr. Neil is entitled to be an agitator." The initial trustees of the foundation included Gough Whitlam, Don Dunstan, Neville Wran, Harry Messel, Manning Clark, Michael Coper, Ray Geetzel and Jocelyn Scott, and now include many previous Lionel Murphy scholars, some of whom are here tonight. The main function of the foundation has been the awarding of postgraduate scholarships, and from 1986 to 2003, close to 100 scholarships to the value of nearly $3 million have been awarded, and many Lionel Murphy scholars have gone on to make a major contribution to Australian public life. Unfortunately, the fund has now been exhausted and the last scholarships were awarded this year, and the foundation will be wound up next year. Planning is underway for a gathering of Lionel Murphy scholars next year to celebrate his life and work and to launch a legacy website with details of the achievements of Lionel Murphy scholars. The second major activity of the foundation has been to hold an annual lecture, and past lecturers have included distinguished speakers such as Bob Hawke, Michael Kirby, Noel Pearson and Pat Anderson. So it's fitting that this, likely the very last Lionel Murphy lecture, is to be delivered by another outstanding Australian on an issue of such huge significance to the future health and well-being of the nation as the forthcoming Voice referendum. And I call upon Professor Sean Brennan, himself a previous Lionel Murphy scholar and a member of the Lionel Murphy Endowment Committee and the lead organiser of this lecture, to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Megan Davis. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I also acknowledge the Gadigal people, and I thank you all for your attendance and interest in the event tonight here at the venue and also joining us online. It's my honour to introduce our speaker tonight for the 2023 Lionel Murphy Memorial Lecture. It is indeed timely as Australia closes in on the holding of the first referendum in the 21st century to alter the wording of the Australian Constitution, that this lecture, in the name of one of the giants of law reform in Australia, Lionel Murphy, is being given by Professor Megan Davis. Megan is an architect of and advocate of law reform, of the constructive use of the law to improve people's lives. As a long-term colleague of Megan's at UNSW Law and Justice, I've had the opportunity from many different angles, I guess, to observe Megan's enormous efforts on so many fronts to bring greater fairness and justice into Australian society and our system of governance through law reform. Her steadfast commitment to seeing through the difficult path of reform to its conclusion is just one of the many obvious things about Megan's sense of service and her values. It's a telltale indication of the length of this particular journey towards a voice referendum that it was in 2020, already several years after the Uluru Statement from the Heart was delivered to the Australian people, that the Lionel Murphy Foundation first lined up Megan to give this memorial lecture on the topic of structural and constitutional reform. That was one long pandemic ago, and now in a different city, in a different time, the trustees of the Lionel Murphy Foundation are very proud to be finally bringing Megan to you here in the New South Wales Parliament House Theaterette and to our online audience. Megan's biography reveals the formidable contribution and versatility she's shown as a leading figure in Australian public life over the past decade. Professor Dr. Megan Davis grew up in Eagleby and Hervey Bay in Queensland and is a Cobble Cobble woman of the Barringham Nation. And to start with her university roles, she's the Pro-Vice Chancellor Society at UNSW Sydney, as well as the Balnaves Chair of Constitutional Law, a Professor of Law, and Director of the Indigenous Law Centre, all at UNSW. But we by no means have her all to ourselves at the university. One whole world for Megan in her professional life is as a leading international lawyer, globally recognised for her expertise in Indigenous rights. That's reflected in her service following an election by the United Nations Human Rights Council to the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, based in Geneva, for 2 terms from 2017 to 2022. Prior to that, she was elected by the UN's Economic and Social Council and served for 6 years as an expert member and chair of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues at UN headquarters in New York. Here in Australia, Megan is an acting commissioner of the New South Wales Land and Environment Court, a fellow of the Australian Academy of Law and a fellow of the Australian Academy of Social Sciences. It would be remiss, of course, not to mention another of the circles in which Megan moves at a very senior level, the world, or perhaps out of respect for the events of the past weekend and David Brown's own fervent commitments, I should say the universe of rugby league. Megan is a commissioner on the national governing body, the Australian Rugby League Commission, a director on the Cowboys Community Foundation Board, and a commissioner for the Western Australian Rugby League Commission. And finally, in the field of law and policy reform, Megan was a commissioner on the Queensland Commission of Inquiry into Youth Detention Centres in 2016, and was the chair and author of Families Culture, an inquiry into New South Wales Aboriginal out-of-home care between 2017 and 2019. Most relevantly to tonight, of course, Megan commenced careful work in designing the deliberative process of 2016-2017 that culminated in the Uluru Statement from the Heart many years ago now. It built on years of careful work as a public lawyer on the issue of constitutional recognition, including as a member of the expert panel appointed by the Gillard government more than a decade ago. Against that background, and through her courageous leadership with Pat Anderson AO of that deliberative process in 2016-17, and her unceasing advocacy of the reform agenda that emerged from Uluru in 2017 ever since, Megan has carved out a national reputation as a leader for this historic process towards 21st century law reform. I'm honoured to introduce to you, to give the 2023 Lionel Murphy Memorial Lecture, Professor Megan Davis.
Thank you, Sean, for that kind introduction. It's a bit weird because Sean and I have been working together at UNSW for about 21 years, just not trying to age us right now, but there's a lot of L'Oreal grey hairspray going on in this campaign, that's for sure. Well, women laugh anyway. So thank you for that kind introduction. I just wanted to begin by recognising the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. And I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I would also like to acknowledge our host, the ANU College of Law, and of course, the Murphy family and the trustees of the Lionel Murphy Foundation. It's an honour to be asked to deliver this lecture tonight. In addresses of this kind, it's commonplace to list the achievements of the person for whom the lecture is named. In this case, I expect that every lecturer mentions the achievements of the pioneering Attorney General and jurist Lionel Murphy. They deserve mention, but I should say from the outset, the Australian story seems to have ingrained a number of narratives about me that people keep reminding me on planes. And one is people keep coming up and asking why Sir John Kerr is my hero. That's not what I said. I said my mum bought me a book that Sir John Kerr wrote from a secondhand bookshop. But in fact, Lionel Murphy was one of those people growing up. And then once I joined the Gilbert and Tobin Centre of Public Law, that we used to talk about a lot in the context of law reform. Because the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the Voice to Parliament referendum is very much the tail end of a very long piece of law reform. And in that law reform, as Sean knows, Sean participated as one of the pro bono lawyers, constitutional lawyers, in the process that we designed and rolled out across the country. Law reform is about imagination. It's about imagining that the world can be different and that the world can be a better place. And that was a difficult thing to bring our people to when we walked into each dialogue, that the country can change and the country can be better. And we said to each dialogue, the Constitution is built to change. That's what the drafters built into the Constitution. It's not for the Parliament to change, but for the Australian people to change. And it was with that conversation with our people about the fact the system is meant to change that we began that journey of the dialogues, what is led now to a referendum in, I think, 10 days, but I'm sure there's members of my staff in the audience that will correct me on that. The achievements of Lionel Murphy are worthy of mentioning from the outset because they were nation-building reforms, many of which we as Australians take for granted. While Attorney General, he introduced or took a leading part in establishing many things, the Family Law Act, the Trade Practices Act, and the establishment of the Australian Law Reform Commission. And in introducing the Law Reform Commission Bill into Parliament in 1973, he said that the government is concerned to see that the system of law under which people live is responsive to the social needs of our time. As a person deeply involved in public life, Lionel Murphy thought and spoke about the great potential of Australia. He believed too, like the Uluru Dialogues, that it could change to meet the challenges of the time. In his lifetime, he was able to see many of his visions become reality. Tonight, in speaking to you about another nation-building reform, the Voice to Parliament, I want to invoke that spirit of Lionel Murphy and of Gough Whitlam and of Dr. Yunupingu and the drafters of the Bark petitions, of Vincent Lingiari and the brave men, women and children who walked off Wave Hill demanding recognition, fair treatment and a better future. And I also want to invoke the men and women of the Uluru Dialogues. The spirit of all the change makers who have worked tirelessly to make our nation a better place. A visionary and reforming spirit, yes, and a deeply practical and pragmatic spirit, a spirit of real change. In doing so, I want to give you some concrete examples of our problem, the torment of our powerlessness. In two particular areas where the powerlessness of First Nations peoples have real life consequences. In justice, where incarceration blights lives and communities across Australia, and in health, where preterm birth imposes dramatic disadvantages on Indigenous Australians from the very start of their lives. Second, I want to share with you some of the independent and expert evidence about how a voice to Parliament would change these problems for the better by giving our people a say on matters that directly affect us and by holding politicians and bureaucrats to account. And finally, I want to reflect on the Uluru Statement itself and its meaning for all Australians in the remaining days of the referendum campaign. Sorry, I played for the Penrith Panthers the other day and I'm a bit... At least I got a laugh. I didn't play for the Warriors. I wouldn't be thirsty then. Sorry, that was a real sledge. I'm sorry. Consider what our justice system does to Aboriginal people. It is not a new topic. 12 years ago in 2011, here at the 25th Lionel Murphy Memorial Lecture, the Honourable Robert McClellan, then the Commonwealth Attorney General, addressed what he called the national shame that is the overrepresentation of Indigenous Australians in the criminal justice system. McClellan's address, in turn, mentioned Justice Murphy's comments. 31 years ago in Crown and Neil, he noted that in 1982, Indigenous Australians, despite making up only 1% of the population, comprised 30% of the prison population. That was in 1982. By 2011, when Robert McClellan was speaking, Indigenous peoples accounted for 26% of the prison population. And in 2022, last year, Indigenous Australians accounted for 32% of the prison populations. McClellan and Murphy were hardly the only ones to notice the problem. Over the years, as we know, there have been a litany of reports, inquiries, and agreements in this area. To name just a few, the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, the Royal Commission into the Protection and Detention of Children in the Northern Territory, the Australian Law Reform Commission's Pathways to Justice, Queensland's Commission of Inquiry into Youth Detention Centres, the New South Wales Parliament Select Committee on the High Levels of First Nations People in Custody and Oversight and Review of Deaths in Custody, and of course the Closing the Gap agreements themselves, which contain socio-economic outcomes aimed at reducing adult incarceration and youth detention. These are just a few, and there are many more. Yet over the carriage of 4 decades, and despite all these reports and commissions, after all those case studies and the programs, the problem is getting worse. This is not to dismiss the work that is done in these areas. There is no doubt initiatives can and do have positive impact in individual cases. But I do call a lot of these approaches and a lot of these mechanisms lipstick on a pig. Many of these reports contain sound recommendations which have never been implemented, some of which governments have never ever responded to. As Tony McAvoy, Senior Counsel, has observed, there seems to have developed a culture of reporting in lieu of doing. The work in this area has not changed the status quo. It is not getting better. These statistics tell plainly of communities, of families in desperation and despair in a country as high income, as wealthy, as educated, as creative as Australia. It is not good enough. There is no sustained pressure. That is why politicians and bureaucrats get away with it. They get away with it because they can, because there's no one to keep them to account. Consider how the health system serves our people, and an especially important example of the gap between the health of Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians is the rate of preterm birth. I hear people talking about Indigenous peoples taking responsibility, but no one is responsible for being born preterm. In ways utterly beyond their control, our young people start a long way back from the pack, from the very first days of their lives, At the starting line of their life, they begin behind. Our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander babies are approximately 1.6 times more likely to be preterm than non-Indigenous babies. Preterm birth is birth that occurs before 37 weeks. It is the leading cause of harm and death for children under 5. Not only is preterm birth an important contributor to childhood disability and death, it is also associated with preventable chronic disease later in life. We know that chronic diseases like diabetes and heart and liver diseases are overrepresented in First Nations communities. Those chronic diseases are a major predictor of early death. If we could reduce preterm birth, we could be closing the gap on other health indicators such as life expectancy. Not to mention the costs preterm birth poses for individuals and families in our healthcare system. There are many examples I could choose to illustrate how the justice and health systems fail Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, just as there are many more systems I could describe that do not serve us in areas from housing to education to employment. I speak about the incarceration of our people, about preterm birth of our children, because I want to be very clear. We are not embarking on an academic exercise here. This is not just philosophizing, and we are not asking for symbolism. I tweeted the other day something from Noel Pearson's National Press Club, actually. He said something quite sad about perhaps we should never have issued the invitation. And I got a quote tweet from a journalist in The Australian who said, basically, I won't use the language, but she said, well, this is not a friendship circle, it's the Constitution. And I was going to quote tweet her, but I thought I don't want to end up in the Daily Mail. But I thought, is she kidding me? The manifestation of constitutional exclusion is what we see today. We know that what we're asking for in the Uluru Statement is not a circle of friendship. Our people have suffered under the exclusion that was set up in the Australian Constitution. With the Uluru Statement and the men and women in the dialogues, many of them grew up in compulsory racial segregation. Many of them were removed from their families at birth. Many of them never had a single cent of what they worked for over their entire lives given back to them. If anyone knows that the Constitution isn't about a friendship circle, it's our people. But the incarceration of our people, the statistics, including preterm birth, these are the manifestations of exclusion. Yes, the Constitution was amended in 1967, but the legacy of that exclusion continues to this day. Here is my second point, and it's where the independent and expert evidence says the same thing as the practical wisdom of the overwhelming majority of our people. Here is the reason Australia hasn't fixed the problem yet, because Australia hasn't given us a proper say on matters that directly affect us. If we think back to the volumes of reports, and there are volumes of reports, because of course everybody who is voting no keeps saying, let's have another Royal Commission, let's have another audit, let's roll up our sleeves and try much harder. Let's get the government to be more generous in their work. Yet none of that actually initiates work, right? It's just words that people say to justify voting no. A uniting theme in all of the volumes, chapters and words, the Royal Commissions and the audits, everything everybody's saying. Dan Tian the other night said, let's have a committee of politicians and we can roll up our sleeves and we can make a difference. Despite all of that, the expenditure, the goodwill, these initiatives do not work because they fail to engage communities. That's why they don't work. Programs fail because decision makers are reluctant to relinquish any real control over decision making. And they fail to do long-term planning backed by long-term funding. Think back just a few months to the Productivity Commission's draft report on closing the gap. It said these reforms are not new ideas. Most of what has been committed to reflects what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been saying for a long time. Indeed, we have. Or think back more than 5 years to the findings of the Royal Commission into the protection and detention of children in the Northern Territory in 2017. You will recall this Royal Commission was called by the Turnbull government in response to media reporting on the violent and abusive treatment of children in the Dondale Detention Centre in Northern Territory. The report from that inquiry acknowledged the reality that reporting exposed. These abuses and this violence are grossly and disproportionately meted out to Aboriginal children. As a way forward, the report noted the changes the Commission has suggested will only happen if governments listen to Aboriginal people's ideas and include Aboriginal people in the decisions at every step of the way. Or turn back more than 30 years to the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, delivered in 1991. If Australians can, in a spirit of justice and humanity, accord Aboriginal people the freedom to determine their own future and provide them with the resources that are necessary to overcome the handicaps they suffer as a result of what has happened in the past, there can be hope. But also the Royal Commission said the government would be doing non-Aboriginal society a service. The resolution of the Aboriginal problem has been beyond the capacity of non-Aboriginal policy makers and bureaucrats. I think all Australians agree with that. The Royal Commission said it's about time they left the stage to those who collectively know the problems at national and local levels. They know the solutions because they live with the problems. This is 30 years ago. The independent expert findings over 4 decades stretching back to the last century, they're enduring. They are insistent. The problems in the justice system cannot be solved without listening to Aboriginal people first. The same is true of the experts who have looked at our health system. As health professionals, they witness firsthand the disparity between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. They also see the signs of possibility and they know the stories of hope. If I can use the example of birthing in our community model, it was a partnership in Southeast Queensland between 2 Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations and a Brisbane maternity hospital. Key components of their program, Birthing in Our Community, included Indigenous governance, a co-design service, local leadership, and an increased Indigenous workforce. In other words, they listened to the Indigenous voice. And what happened? Over 6 years, from 2013 to 2019, the model reduced the proportion of preterm births almost to parity with non-Indigenous babies. It saw an average cost saving of $4,810 per mother-baby care. It was more effective and less costly than standard maternal care. Modelling estimated that replication of this model across the country could reduce the number of First Nations babies born preterm each year by almost 1,000. This would lead to long-term health expenditure savings of more than $86 million. This is listening. This is self-determination. It works. And I acknowledge the tension between these examples people keep bringing up in relation to the voice. We want the voice, but he's an example of success without a voice. But these successful models, these successful case studies are few and far between. And I've mentioned before what we're hearing from the no camp, the reasons why people say you don't need a voice because you've got these examples of success. And on the other side, they're saying, oh, all you need to do is roll up your sleeves. Well, that's not a technical, legal, or constitutional reform. Work harder, Warren Mundine said. We just have to work harder. Well, that's not legal or technical or constitutional. Dan Tehan said last night or the night before, my days are just blurring into one. Bipartisanship, he said. Bipartisanship, that's the solution. Yeah, we've tried that. An audit. People keep tweeting at me saying an audit. Yeah, we've done audits. Australian National Audit Office, there's many audits. Be more generous, someone said the other day in an op-ed criticising all the Yes campaign. We just need a government who is more generous. That's again, not a technical or legal, it's not a policy. Be more generous. Sustained attention. It's okay to say that on this side of the referendum, but who's going to initiate that sustained attention on the other side? No one. You saw on Q&A, Mullenderry, Tehan, these guys are locked in a political tussle, right? They all want to get elected. The ALP, the LNP, that's what they're locked in. You can be damn sure if there's a no case, there's no sustained attention or rolling up sleeves. The whole point of the reform is to force them to roll up their sleeves, right? Is to force the sustained attention, is to force them to be more generous, is to make them work more harder. That's the important thing that we talked about in the dialogues, is about how do we use this offer that the Australian community and the Australian government and the Australian Parliament came to us with in 2011. Hey, we'd like to recognise you in the Constitution. What does that look like to you? And after 12 years, the answer was recognition through a voice. The voice could help to secure the reliable, sustained funding that is essential to ensure First Nations community-controlled organisations like the health sector in this example can accelerate progress in health improvement. The voice will be able to make constitutional representations to governments about the removal of the barriers which could see this reform coordinated and applied more broadly to drive better health outcomes and save public money. Because Dan Tehan, sorry, not to pick on Dan Tehan, but last night he said the problem wasn't government, the problem is tiers of government, apparently. We've got multiple layers of government. But we've been a federation for a very, very long time. Yeah, the tiers of government are not the problem. If they knew how to fix up the issue with the tiers of government, they would have done it by now. So it's no wonder that the Australian Medical Association and 125 of Australia's leading medical organisations agree. Last week, they stated their confident belief that the voice will enhance government decision-making about matters that affect our people, ultimately improving health outcomes. No wonder the justice system expert reports agree. Listen to Aboriginal people's ideas. Include Aboriginal people in decisions. This is where the Uluru Dialogues came in. A comprehensive and deliberative process held in 2016 and 2017 across this country, where mob were asked the question, what does meaningful constitutional recognition look like? It was a process which saw each of the 12 regional dialogues prioritise as meaningful recognition a voice to Parliament. Yeah, an enhanced role in the participation of Australian democracy. They didn't choose treaty first. They chose participation in Australian democracy. This is the origin of the voice. It came from the heart. It comes from a need to be listened to be taken seriously, to be given power to chart our own path and decide our own destinies. It comes from a desire to put into practice what these experts have recommended. It's been sad about the campaign in that the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the men and women from communities who participated in it have been ridiculed and pilloried and belittled. But they held a really earnest belief in Australian democracy, a belief in the power of voice, a belief in Australian democracy, a commitment to a civic exercise of constitutional reform and constitutional agency. It comes from a simple truth. When you listen to people who experience the problem that you are trying to solve, you get closer to solving it. This is the simple power of the voice. It can offer up to the Parliament and the Executive the direct experiences of our people and our ideas and our wisdom. It can hold governments to account for the promises that they make. It can ensure that when money is spent, it goes to the right place. It's spent on the right things and it's done in the right way. And we say all Australians stand to benefit from this. We all have skin in the game. And so we are here, October 2023, days away from the opportunity for the most significant reform of most Australians' lifetime. One that is modest but profound. One that marries a long overdue recognition of Australia's First Peoples and the constitution of this nation, together with a practical mechanism for change. One that requires a national vote in about 11 days, I think. Some of the public debate has been pretty bitter and demoralising, and it has had a huge impact on our community, and especially our Jarjams, our young people. But we still have faith, despite the polls. We still have faith in our ability to get along and to reach agreement. We still have faith in our people and our powers of persuasion and diplomacy that can make the voice work. Our mob have done this work now for 2 centuries. Patience, advocacy, listening, talking among mob, talking to power, respecting other points of view, compromise, and slowly building momentum for change. Process. That's the really important thing that sits at the heart of the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the Voice to Parliament. Process. We did it in the dialogues, we did it at Uluru. Despite the horrors of Aboriginal history, and many of you would know from the Uluru Statement, it's contained in the Referendum Council report, a story that's called Our Story. And what we've done is pull together the quotes in all of the Butcher's paper from our people about history and the things that have happened to our people, because that's the conversation that need to be had, because before we could move on to constitutional reform. There was an earnest lament in every single dialogue before we started, or we would start, and people would say, don't they want to know what happened to us in our own country? And there was this deep concern that there was people who wanted to recognise us but didn't want to know what had happened to us. And they spoke of all of the stories of the dispossession, the killing times, compulsory racial segregation, stolen children, stolen wages. And despite all of that, at Uluru, our people spoke of forgiveness. They spoke of love. They spoke of moving forward. Most Australians want to move beyond this point. And I have faith in us as a nation to do this. Saturday week, Australians will go to the polls and will be asked to vote yes or no on a very simple question. A proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve this proposed alteration? This is the right question to ask, and we are asking the right people. The referendum question is a question put to the Australian people. It's not put to politicians or bureaucrats. A decision won't be made by politicians or bureaucrats. It won't even be made by experts or campaigners or elites, as they call them. It will be made by all Australians, millions of Australians who decide what they think is best for our shared future. I know that millions of Australians have heard our call, the invitation that we issued at The Rock in 2017 to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future, and they've already begun voting yes. Today, I want to address myself to millions of other Aussies. I want to speak to every Australian who is still undecided. To the undecided millions, I want to say two things. First, thank you for waiting till you are sure. Thank you for taking your time to make up your mind. We are sorry you've been given the hard task of sifting through a mountain of disinformation and misinformation on social media and mainstream media, and a relentless slew of negativity in parts of the press. Thank you for thinking about this carefully and taking your democratic rights seriously. The second thing I want to say is, why don't you come for a walk with us? Why don't you come for a walk with us now? I think we're ready to go as a nation. I think the time is right. With all my heart, speaking from all my experience of the problems of Australia's First Peoples in our country, problems we confront every day of our lives, I ask you to vote yes. Yes means we believe in our own potential. Yes means we listen to more than 80% of First Nations peoples who support the voice. Yes means we listen to the overwhelming majority of our legal profession. What Patrick Dodson called those eminent legal giants, our country's finest legal minds, who say that the voice makes our systems stronger and safer. Yes means we start the doing. On October 14, we can get to the start line. On October 15, we can wake up to a new and more equal country, and we can start the doing. We can wake up to a country that has decided that the past should not be a burden on our future. We can do that with yes. I want to end by reading the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Don't worry, we won't be here all week. It's not 28 pages. It's not 180, it's actually one page. As many of you know, the issuing of petitions from First Nations peoples is a really common thing in the common law world. Aboriginal people have been issuing one-page statements since the early 1800s, and they began here in New South Wales. That is the tradition that the Uluru Statement is based upon. It's been one of the greatest privileges of my life to lead this process and be involved in this process. And one of the greatest privileges ever to be the first person to read out the historic document at Uluru in 2017. I was there for all the dialogues, all of the planning and the national conference, the 3 days, and for the years of planning beforehand, like my colleague Sean Brennan. This is a document which imbues a profound love of our country and a profound faith in the Australian people. Never not believe that. Our people sat there after a long period of deliberation and said, we're not going to issue this. We're not going to do the bark petition thing. We're not going to do the petition and put it on a bark painting. We're just going to stand up without the painting, without the bark anything, And we're just going to read it out to the Australian people. Let's read out to them a logic as to why we think this is important. We will issue it as a hand of friendship, as a sign of love, as a roadmap to peace. I know this has been belittled and joked about on Sky News and other media sites, but nothing could be further from the truth. This was an earnest statement from our people that despite everything that has happened to them, they wanted to respond with love. Our old people at Uluru, our elders, chose to issue this as an invitation to you, the Australian people, not to government, not to politicians, but to you. Despite our history of dispossession and the painful manifestation of that in our contemporary lives, after all of it, we have never lost faith in the essential goodness and decency of the Australian people. We are asking you to meet us here at the Rock and walk with us. We did the work that was asked of us. We have the answer. All you need to do is say yes. We gathered at the 2017 National Constitutional Convention, coming from all points of the southern sky, make this statement from the heart. Our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent islands, and possessed it under our own laws and customs. This our ancestors did, according to the reckoning of our culture from the creation, according to the common law from time immemorial, and according to science more than 60,000 years ago. This sovereignty is a spiritual notion, the ancestral tie between the land or Mother Nature and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom, remain attached thereto, and must one day return thither to be united with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It has never been ceded or extinguished and coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. How could it be otherwise? That peoples possessed a land for 60 millennia and this sacred link disappears from world history in merely the last 200 years? With substantive constitutional change and structural reform, we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. Proportionally, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. We are not an innately criminal people. Our children are aliened from their families at unprecedented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them. And our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for the future. These dimensions of our crisis tell plainly the structural nature of our problem. This is the torment of our powerlessness. We seek constitutional reforms to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish. They will walk into worlds and their culture will be a gift to their country. We call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia, and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. We seek a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. In 1967, we were counted. In 2017, we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and start our trek across this vast country. And we invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. We do have a short period of time before we head upstairs for questions from the floor. I'll also be keeping my eye here online. Did anyone want to ask a question of Megan? And we've got a roving mic at the back there. Do you mind heading over to grab that mic when it's finished? Thanks.
Hello. Oh, no, actually not. There's an on button here somewhere. Hello. I didn't quite catch what you said, but I think you mentioned partway through your speech that this referendum will be the most significant change in most of our lives, or for most of the generation. Do you see it as being more significant than the plebiscite we had recently for marriage equality, given that it does have no racial bias to it, and that was a substantial change or reform in a lifetime of everybody here?
It was a plebiscite for a change in legislation. It wasn't an amendment to the Australian Constitution. So yeah, I think it's more significant.
If this question's out of line, just let it go. But it concerns the word sovereignty. I hear it a lot, and I've looked for the meaning in different dictionaries, and I just can't get my mind around what it actually means, what it entails, and how do I recognise it.
So there's lots of definitions of sovereignty, as you've seen when you've looked in the dictionary and no doubt read many other documents, yeah? So in the dictionary, it means like the location of power, yeah? That's what you've read? So a big part of the Uluru Statement was about the fact that the country was dispossessed without any formal agreement between First Nations peoples and the arrivals. And that has been the subject of a grievance since then. And a very large proportion, if not all Aboriginal people, would like some recognition of that dispossession and what it means that there was no recognition of the sovereignties that existed on the Australian continent prior to the arrivals. So you hear in the treaty debate, people talk about treaty and sovereignty in this context. So treaties were used in the very early period, so in 1788, presumably could have been used as a way of managing those relationships between the multiple polities who actually own the land and the arrivals who, in the context of the Uluru Statement and the work through Uluru, people have chosen from now on to use the word invasion, right? A big part of the discussion around treaty is how you acknowledge what has happened and what that means in the context of sovereignty, because of course, sovereignty in 1788 doesn't mean what it means in 2023. because of course Australian sovereignty doesn't mean what it meant in 1788. So if we reflect on Australian sovereignty today, we've signed up to multiple United Nations agreements, World Trade Organization agreements, bilateral trade agreements. There's all sorts of ways in which Australian parliamentary sovereignty has been chipped away at. And so sovereignty today doesn't mean what it meant in 1788, and nor does it mean the same thing in the context of Aboriginal people and who Aboriginal people are. The Uluru Statement speaks about a spiritual sovereignty. It draws upon the Western Sahara case in the International Court of Justice that was cited by Chief Justice Brennan in the Mabo decision. It's meant to be a way of explaining the spiritual connection of First Nations people to the land. And it's meant to kind of talk about the co-location of two sovereignties on this, well, it wouldn't be two sovereignties, but multiple sovereignties on the continent. And it's meant to, I mean, the big part of the Uluru Statement and what it offers is a kind of roadmap through that. Because of course people have high expectations that treaty means some sort of 1788 agreement, but it's not going to be, because all treaties, by the looks of it, across the continent, across the Federation, will be ordinary acts of parliament, meaning whatever is decided or negotiated in a treaty, it's going to require political agreement, which means Labor, the LNP, the Greens, like a whole parliament's going to have to agree on that treaty. That's not what happened in, first contact treaties. So that's a really convoluted way of explaining to you that sovereignty is a complex word. It can mean many, many things, but its fundamental idea is, where is power located? And I think the question of sovereignty in relation to First Nations peoples is really going to be one, and most mob agree with this, that is for the state to grapple with when they do treaties, which is not what the Uluru Statement is about. A voice to Parliament, obviously, is a very practical change to the Australian Constitution, but that the question of sovereignty, and Sean knows a lot more about treaties and sovereignty than I do, as far as I know, is dealt with at that level of treaties or agreements between the state and Indigenous First Nations peoples. So it's not always easy to understand what sovereignty means. For our people, we say we retain our sovereignty. Sovereignty is something that is in you. It's a part of you. It's part of you and your culture and your country. And we say it doesn't matter what anybody does. Nobody can take your sovereignty away from you. It's always here. So the Uluru Statement kind of emphasised that really important spiritual notion of it, although there are some that prosecute a different idea of sovereignty. But the Uluru Statement really is very much about the bringing together of all of our peoples and the multiple polities that make up First Nations Australians under Australian democracy. That's what it's about. It's about coexistence. No worries.
Any last questions before we finish for the evening? Thank you.
Hello. So you touched on some of the reasons that we've heard coming from the No campaign. I guess what I just wanted to hear your thoughts on was, in my view, some of the most compelling things that we've heard come out of the No campaign are from other Indigenous people who say that while in theory a voice to Parliament sounds excellent in that people will be consulting the people that these policies will go on to affect, but they say they don't have any faith or confidence that it will actually lead to better outcomes for Indigenous people, and that there's no actual obligation on people in Parliament to take this advice on, not just, as you say, and you spoke quite extensively about how people in Parliament have just ignored various recommendations and advice that has been made for decades. I guess I just wanted to hear your thoughts on how you would counter that argument.
There's a few. So the first thing I just want to convey to everybody that it's not true that a majority of people don't support this. It's simply not true. It's just the way that it's being managed by mainstream media and misinformation, disinformation is that it's a very small minority of mob. And yes, they are all over Instagram and TikTok. I mean, it looks like a lot. That mob don't support it. It's not true. The research is really robust, from remote communities to regional communities to urban communities. Our people are really pragmatic people. Yeah, they were asking for a voice in terms of a proper engagement with Australian parliaments in the colonial period in like the early 1830s. So that's one point I want to make. The second point I want to make is we've gone across this country for the past 7 years, but in terms of face-to-face engagement with Aussies on the question, for about 8 months, I think. I'm looking at my team. I think it's 8 months. And all we ever hear is how much Australians don't trust politicians. They don't trust them. They don't trust Australian democracy. And they're saying to us, why are you bothering when you can't trust them? You know, they're not saying, you know, the race argument doesn't come up much. A lot of the other arguments, but there is this profound mistrust, which I think there's a lot of public lawyers in the room, that we should all be really disturbed by, actually. I've been really shocked by what I've heard. And so the question for them, and I've spoken to a lot of them, not every Australian, obviously. I've done a bit of FNQ, a lot of Southeast Queensland and bits of New South Wales and stuff, but mostly regional, and then Logan's all very urban. It's a really interesting conversation with them, because what are we meant to do? So they're not saying dismantle Australian democracy, right? Just because it doesn't work for them. And we had a group of people that came to one event at John Paul College in Logan. Is a bunch of blokes, tradies and high vis, and they were like, just went off their nut, you know. You can't trust them. Why are you not why are you wasting your time, but we're voting no. Anyway, I talked to them afterwards and I said, come next week. So I came back next week to an event at Bethania, and we did the whole, it was a bit longer, it was much more people, but they came up at the end and these blokes were like, all right, so we think government screws us over a lot. We don't trust them. He's like, but I can see that they screw you over more. He's like, I just want you to know, I just rang my mates and we're voting yes. Now, they were no a couple of weeks ago. But my point to your point is there's a lot of clever clogs just saying, oh, there's no reciprocal obligation of the state to respond. Yep, well, you know what? We've hit the tolerance or the threshold of what Australian legal and political systems will tolerate. We have hit the threshold. So it's not perfect. It's not. But there's a few things that we say that are important to kind of mitigate the concerns that you've raised, that your Aboriginal colleagues and stuff have raised, right? The status quo is worse, yeah? No is no progress. Like no is like waking up on the 15th and Labor's still in charge and the LNP, and they're just gonna move on, yeah? Because they're just eyeing off the next election. So the status quo is nothing for us. There will be no progress. That is the fact. And the nation will have endorsed that. I'm not saying that in a narky way. I'm saying it will be endorsed. That's why Albanese won't legislate for a voice, because it will be an endorsement of the Australian people for the status quo. The second point I will make, and I don't care if people think I'm a Pollyanna, but the Australian people voting together to say yes to this is a big thing. It's not a small thing. We've never had something like this in Australian history. The mandate of the Australian people is not a small thing. Australians walking together to vote yes is not a small thing. I know people look at me cynically and go, they're still going to ignore you. No, they can't. It's a constitutional referendum that asks them to set up a body that Australians vote yes to. We feel like there's power behind the mandate of the Australian people voting yes. That's why we decided to issue the statement to as Aussies, because we had that conversation at the Rock and we had the conversation at the dialogues around the country that Australians were equally, you know, miffed by the fact that there's inertia at a Commonwealth level on basically everything. Like fires have just started and they still talk crap about climate change in Canberra. Like this is a unity ticket, right? The second thing about the no obligation to respond is, well, actually we also think we hit the kind of limits of constitutional tolerance for what the voice can do. I mean, I don't know I know who invented the veto thing and put it out through social media. But veto came from this idea in international law that FPIC, free, prior and informed consent, can lead to veto. But there's very few examples in the world where FPIC has led to veto. It's just nonsense. FPIC sits on a spectrum, right? Anyway, I'm not going to go into the FPIC. I was about to go into it too. Everyone's like, can she shut up? My point is, you were never able to veto. Who can veto the parliament? That's one thing. But we also feel that a voice that's set up and designed by our mob goes through the parliament. We know ATSIC Act, we know Native Title Act were the longest pieces of legislation in Australian history, right? So it's going to take a long time to get that through, presumably. But when the voice comes out the other side, I mean, what blackfellow would criticise our mob speaking together, our voices talking together collectively? That is a strong thing. This is a model that's not, people go on and on, but there is no model, yeah? It's not Carmel Langton, it's not any of those. There's not 24 people or 16 people. The design is yet to happen. And the first people we talk to is our own mob. Get their ideas, and then that goes into the parliament, that goes into the parliamentary committees, then Aussies get input, then more mob get input, then the politicians get their go through the House of Reps and the Senate. Whatever it looks like though, as if our people talking collectively on the issues that affect our people in grassroots communities is not going to have an impact. We know that the key issues in our community, they're not Australia Day. Most people don't even want us. I mean, I've written so many op-eds on it, but I don't want it moved. Moving it just moves the problem. It just creates a problem on another day. Australia Day at its core is about the original grievance, right? But we get to talk about things like poison water, right? The ageing infrastructure, the fact that copper is seeping into people's water and people are sick. The fact that Queensland government has to put a story onto 7:30 report asking the mob of Yarrabah, which are 40 minutes outside Cairns, to run their tap for 20 minutes before they drink it. And then the traces of copper might disappear. Like, this is what we're dealing with in Australia, and it never gets any traction in terms of mainstream media. We know now from the research through this period of the campaign that 30% of Australians don't even know Indigenous people are disadvantaged. So that superannuation, the fact that most of our mob die between 50 and 60 and they want their super and they want to prep so they can hand on property or income to their kids and make sure all their affairs are settled. Every time someone turns 50, we get all of this stuff from TOs about them prepping. I mean, it sounds morbid, but that's the stuff our people grapple with in having a smaller life expectancy. That's the stuff that the constitutional representations will be made of. Australians will probably be quite shocked about the things that actually matter in our communities. And one of those things is running water. It's a long answer to your question, but I just really am at the limits of my tolerance for mob arguing that the fact that there's no reciprocal obligation to respond or implement makes it a powerless reform. It is not a powerless reform. It's the Australian Constitution. And it's our voices, and our voices have been mandated by the Australian people. And like I said, I'm happy to be called a Pollyanna, but that is a powerful, powerful amendment.
I know that we have a party online and people in the audience who are keen to ask questions, but it is time to bring the formalities of tonight to an end so that we can adjourn upstairs for more conversations. So I just want to finish tonight with a formal thanks to Megan. As she said, along with my UNSW colleagues, Gabriel Appleby and Gemma McKinnon, as members of a small legal support team, we were able to see at close quarters that monumental feat of leadership that Megan demonstrated together with Pat Anderson in the period that culminated at Uluru in May 2017. Taking that carefully designed but very ambitious deliberative process on the road, region by region, around Australia, asking busy people facing enormous challenges in their own ordinary working lives to set aside days to tackle complex questions of constitutional and structural reform. and to try and find a consensus on the reforms that people so desperately need. And then to take those regional outcomes up a step to a national level. That was a historic undertaking. And it required intellectual leadership, patience, persistence against what often seemed like improbable odds from the beginning. And so through her leadership skills and influence, Megan, together with Pat, was able to weld together a small but effective team that could practically support people, their people in each region in their deliberations for what became a growing community of participants as regional co-conveners, as working group leaders, as delegates at a regional dialogue, and ultimately delegates to the Uluru Convention. It took courage for people like Megan to go into the unknown with that deliberative process where no one knew how it would end up, or even if the 3-day model of deliberation would stand up and work. So Megan, Pat, Noel, the members of the Indigenous Standing Steering Committee of the Referendum Council, were willing to take people into that complex territory with those strongly divergent positions in the room, a difficult political environment in the mid-2010s as a result of people not having their voices heard by government. And as I said, the outcome of that process was not certain until the final stages at Uluru. And the people leading it from the beginning didn't shy away from the big issues and the hard discussions that people had to have if they were going to share confidence in the outcome, if it was going to be a legitimate outcome from that process. And along the way, Megan with Pat were inspirational and relentlessly committed to the process, as she talked about tonight, and the people involved. And she and Pat have stayed faithful to those people and their good faith participation in a process that the government asked them to engage in to deliver an answer back to a question about meaningful constitutional recognition, regardless of what the odds might have looked like. And we know there was no easy path to acceptance in Canberra after that offer was made to the Australian people in 2017. But Megan and those around her have stayed faithful to that sense of things she talked about tonight, of imagination and optimism, of pragmatism and vision, of practical, sustained change for the better that informed the deliberative process of the regional dialogues and the Uluru Convention, and that, as I said, Megan talked about tonight. So Megan's work in the 6 years and counting since at the helm of the Uluru Dialogues, together with Pat Anderson, has now helped bring a whole nation to the point of deliberation on the question before us, whether to recognise the First Peoples of Australia in the Constitution through an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. So I hope of the new sense of urgency or energy or insights that you've gained from tonight's lecture, I hope you can inform everyone you know in the conversations you have with family, friends, neighbours and colleagues in the next 10 or 11 days about what is at stake for Australia and the gains be made by First Nations people and all Australians. Megan's had a crazy schedule for years on this referendum, now for many months, and of course with the campaign in full flow, even more so in recent weeks. So on behalf of the trustees of the Lionel Murphy Foundation, I ask you to show you one more time your appreciation to Megan for delivering tonight's Lionel Murphy lecture.